Okay, so as Sarah said, right, talk about tool chains. And actually, we tried to be a little bit creative with the title here, why tools fail to chain and how to make them chain again, right? So let me quickly walk through a couple of thoughts that Felipe and I and others in that community have. Just maybe as a starting point, like there's not too much technical detail into that presentation. Obviously, aside the demo that Felipe is going to give, but it's rather a call for collaboration, I would call it that, right? So there are a couple of hopefully inspirational thoughts that we are having, and I would really like you guys to think about that as well and see whether you would like to join that journey together with us. So why tools fail to chain, and well, no, what is the background of the thoughts that we are having here? So I mean, I think we all agree, looking into the landscape of tools for automotive software development as of today, there's a variety of tools that you actually need, right? Variety of compilers, the variety of IDEs potentially, many different other tools for testing and validation and then deployment. Like it's a mess pretty much, right? Also the complexity of the applications, meaning the workloads that go into the vehicle that needs to be developed. I mean, they have become more and more complex over the last 10, 15 years maybe, and they will potentially get even more complex, which in combination obviously creates a high load, a high cognitive load onto the developer, because they have to decide, okay, now I have to do that task and I need to remember which tool I need to use and how I need to use that, and my UX might be completely different from when I'm in a different task for another achievement that I need to get. So they have to do an increasing amount of context switches, which is obviously, well, high cognitive loads are usually one of the reasons why quality is going down or things are getting slow, right? And just as the quote says at the bottom here, the more links you have in your tool chain, the more complex and potentially brittle it is. And on the other hand side, the fewer links, the more resilient the tool chain is likely to be. So just also to quickly recap where we are coming from our perspective there, I think we started with single tools or single tool chains, however you want to call that. That all of a sudden, developed into, oh, it's not just about developing, it's also about operating. So we got a DevOps tool chain by now. And then given these various contexts that we would have, you now find yourself in jiggling around various tool chains for various contexts that you need to provide automotive software in. So it's a pretty complex system and a task of platform engineering by now that needs to be somehow handled with respect to tool chains for automotive software development. And I mean, hopefully by now you kind of would agree with me that that there might be a certain benefit on integrating these tools together. So why is it that we would look into how we can actually chain these tools again? So obviously you have an interest in make reuse as much as possible, right? So if you can reuse certain applications for different contexts, that might be helpful. I mean, A, it saves money, and B, it also reduces the cognitive load because the UX for a developer stays the same for different contexts that he or she needs to work in. Also, I briefly touched upon the topic of quality already, but also think about, especially from a traceability perspective, right? If you have different sets of tool chains for different ECUs or different compute units that you need to develop in, like how would you trace the root cause and how would you do that analysis of that root cause between these different tools? I see Dana nodding. I think you can tell, right?
Very good point.
Yeah. So that is for sure also something that, why we believe that we should really think about how we can integrate these different tools with each other. And last but definitely not least, of course, actually improve the developer productivity here to really make sure that people can actually focus on developing instead of handling varieties of tools there. How to achieve that, and that is now, let's say, the part call for collaboration, if you want so, because ultimately, I assume, I mean, looking in that community now for the last 2.5 years, I know that there are many companies here that actually have tools that help software developers, automotive software developers, to achieve their tasks, be it for developing or for testing, validating, deployment, whatever, you name it. But I'm pretty sure that we or let's say hopefully also all agree that none of us like individually have the capability in their company to build a tool that will basically do it all, right? That will achieve everything with just that single product that every customer will be happy with. So we definitely need a way how we can combine these different tools and these different tool chains in and that's why I marked it in red, in a standardized way. Because obviously anybody of us, well, can come up or probably already could or came already up with the idea of, yeah, okay, there's the mechanism of plugins, and here's our proprietary way for other third parties to develop a plugin. Okay, that's at least some sort of composability and extensibility, but it's for sure not a standardized way. And if I am that third party, I would have to develop 15 plugins because there are 15 other products, right? So find a way how we standardize that composability and that extensibility is one of the, let's say, initial thoughts and tasks that we see there. And, you know, just as an illustration, and I think by now you can already see where I'm going, obviously, with having that kind of talk in front of this community. I mean, just as an example list here, right? You see different capabilities on the left and the right of that picture that toolchains might have. There might be things that are missing. I'm not arguing about the completeness here, but the main message here is that we should really start thinking about an open source collaboration of defining the standardized way that I talked on the slide before, so that we can actually, you know, find a common ground of how we are making sure that these tools and tool chains interoperate with each other. One thing that is important here for me, because Philippe and I, we talked about that, that if you see that, it smells a little bit like, okay, let's define an API, just make a specification project out of that, and we are done. That would not be my favorite, to be honest. Many of you know that I'm not the specification fan, let's say. I mean, this is one of the patterns in that community. We would really like to be code first. So let's think about at least the reference implementation for these kind of APIs and integration points, and then see how we can go from there. I think we have one other example slide, and then I'm handing it over to Philippe. Just again, as an example, right? Imagine on the left side, you would have a tool that is specialized in infotainment-related development, for example, having your different capabilities there of virtual device environment, testing and code quality and whatnot. And on the right side, you have a tool that is specialized in embedded software development. Like, again, these are two different tool landscapes, most likely even, for the different tasks that you have. But if you really want to test, for example, the infotainment, you would need, during the test, you would need data from the embedded ECUs to do that. So the question is, like, how do you integrate that, right? And Philippe is going to talk about that in a second, I guess, a little bit more. But the two main ideas that we're having here is around metadata. So how do we actually describe the capabilities that the different tools have? How do we make that known to other tools? And then also the orchestration piece, like if that tool and that tool chain needs something from that guy over there, how does that kind of orchestration actually works between the two of them? If that is standardized as well, that also helps for that kind of transparency there and that orchestration task that is then a distributed orchestration, as a matter of fact. Alrighty, I think I'm rushing through a little bit, but maybe that helps getting back on track for the agenda. By handing it over to Philippe.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. I tried to do the demo in the morning, but the network was a little bit unstable. So I have to have some. Anyway, so let's see how the demo works using a couple of screenshots of the actual demo that I was planning. So this is not. Where is the?
So I have a generic question. So since we are all not fans of API projects, how do you suppose of having a standardized, exchangeable, blocked, organized sort of toolchain?
Well, I'm not saying I'm not a fan of APIs. I'm saying I'm not a fan of API only.
API only.
So for sure you need that API spec.
Yeah.
But if you can at least also provide a reference implementation for that API, that would be helpful.
And I heard during today several presentations that talked about the need for configuration services, integration with multiple orchestrators, different levels of orchestration between the cloud and the edge. I like to call cars the edge. Who cares?
The vehicle.
Yeah. There are multiple different tools involved there, right? So the approach that we are taking here is, of course, leveraging an existing, and a lot of what we have done is based on the lessons learned from these past 2 years within the community. We have been working very, very closely on the software orchestration blueprint, for example, with Ankaios and the Blue Chi team about how to orchestrate the in-vehicle workloads, but also how the workloads are defined in the cloud, right, and how you manage all of this process. And basically with the project Symphony that was announced and proposed, submitted, open source by, I think it was November last year, we realized that there was a potential opportunity to take the Symphony API because it's completely agnostic of the cloud and the edge part. Look at the object model and the metadata that Symphony leverages to orchestrate multiple workloads, right? Being again in the cloud or in the edge. And then try to come up with, and this is what we are going to propose here on the demo, come up with an example of basically a configuration services that can help you package and define the processes and the scenarios that you need to orchestrate the multiple tools and tool chains. And that's how we started. So yeah, an API spec would take probably ages.
Yeah.
Let's try with a code first approach. Let's see how it fails. Learn, and then just make it ideally right for the community, right? So let me move on. What we are about to see on the demo, and again, apologies because I was really planning to do a live demo of the system. The network was not really great. I'm also I don't have a 4G connection here in Germany. But basically what we are going to see, and what we came up with the idea was that we can package the multiple, or ideally we can define the multiple workloads, tools and tool chains and scenarios under what we describe as templates. We provide extensibility so that you can build your own extensions, you can customize your own extensions because we don't know which tools are coming in the future, right? So it cannot be a closed spec and cannot be a closed metadata. It's highly important to manage relationships, and I heard multiple sessions today about dependency graphs. I saw and I listened very carefully about Zeno and the way they are looking at the problem domain. The fact that they use also declarative way of doing their data flows is pretty much all those same concepts that are here. And again, we don't want to reinvent the wheel. We think that Symphony could be that initial, at least, kickoff for us to fail and make it right again. And so we came up with this demo and this proposal that we will open source by September, October, around the OCX and the open conference for that I hope to see you all for automotive in October. And the reason for that is just we are going through a couple of internal processes at Microsoft to open source the code. But what you see is we define those templates and extensions, and basically the tool chain, metadata services, and it's really a bad name, and I will come up with something even better like Ibergi or Chariot. Let's see, for a project name. But we need some way to define these configurations, right? Call it metadata, call it configuration services. You read that definition, you need to have options for override the configurations. You want, of course, then to make, validate, and build and ensure that your dependency graph is correct. Then you need to look at extensions. Again, it's important that you are able to load extensions from multiple sources, not only internally from your own organizations, but also from open source. So for example, when you start looking at projects like, I don't know, Eclipse SDV, and you make it part of an SOP, you have the same way to source that upstream, right? And make everything that you need from a security management perspective to introduce into your downstream product. And this is what we mean by staging or referencing extensions. And then when you are happy with all of that as a developer or as a tester, and this is one of the key points here, we come up with we don't build a new data model. We don't build a new configuration model. We just project these into some artifacts that Symfony knows how to process. And some of the work we are doing with the community already is, for example, seeing how Symfony can work with Ankaios so that we can project to Ankaios the workloads and the configurations that they need to pull up the software inside the car and start orchestrating the software. So again, I think it's all the spirit about open source and also about these, there is no kingmaker. It's all about integrating with several projects. I also see an opportunity for OpenDUT because in the end they are, in my opinion, building substantially amount of good IP that I think we can collaborate together, but this is also valid for the other projects that I've learned today. So let's move on and see if this moves. So what do we have? Yes, we are packaging everything as a dev container. This is again a screenshot. It's running on a Linux machine. If you want, you can also run it on Windows. Again, it doesn't really matter. What do you see here? If the button works. Yes, it's a dev container. We have what we describe as the scenario template. So you can see here from the code that, and I'm going to use the, the typical always presented virtual ECU, the magic virtual ECU that we can create on the cloud. I know nothing about ECUs, by the way. I just know about some cloud software development, but nevertheless. So this is the scenario template. It contains some metadata. We have a scenario. Think about you need to deploy a certain cloud compute target with an operating system, which represents your virtual ECU. You have some metadata to define that, and we'll look into it. And we have a couple of custom extensions, and I'll show you a little bit some of those. But as you can see, and of course, I work for Microsoft. I think it was evident from the introduction. And I'm using Azure to showcase some of the examples. But there is nothing here that prevents you to run on any other, cloud or, on-prem, your own machine. Moving on, if you can. Then we have made these metadata services or configuration services today available as a CLI tool, so you can run it on your own powerful command line. And we also built an HTTP service for that. And we will be building also REST API so that you have also the configuration services as an API available to you to host it wherever you want. Moving on. So this is how it looks like. There is way much more complexity behind the scenes if you see it on this YAML file. But a couple of things I want to call out. We are not kingmakers in the sense that we understand that your tools and tool chains need to integrate with the existing CI/CDs, with existing tools. So you have a reference here, for example, for GitHub. But I've done prototypes, for example, with Jira as well, right? So instead of using, in this case, GitHub, to build, and this is what we are going to see in the next slide, to build your Yocto operating system, you can actually extend these and run with some other CI/CD platforms. The other thing I also want to call out here is that you can also start defining what is the software stack that you want to show up in that virtual ECU, and we will see this. In this case, again, it's a demo prototype. We are just shipping a small file, hello world, to that ECU, but you can also use it, for example, if you want to orchestrate the deployment of a container. And here, this is where we see the value of doing the work with Ankaios and BlueChi, where they basically, and I need to be careful with time, they can easily do that pull up of the containers by themselves. Moving on. So a concrete example that I did for this conference. Yes, we are going to build one ECU. I'm going to start a build of YoctoOS. YoctoOS takes a long time to build, as you might know. And yes, because I'm using Azure, I have a couple of Azure-specific resources that I'm going to use and leverage to do this orchestration, right? And if we can click several times, one more, one less. One less. Yes, and here this is what, so I need a compute target and I need it in a certain environment that I have, and I have a specific operating system version that I also need to have on that deployment itself. And this is where we are working to make sure that the dependency graph makes sense. And I've had discussions about, can you also anticipate that this version will work with a certain compute that you want to use for this scenario? Moving on. Moving on faster. So again, another one. So what we are looking for here is, as I mentioned, the extensions are customizable, extensible, and you can build your own. And so our idea is that we should meet our customers where they are. So although I'm using GitHub as an example, although I'm using Azure deployment environments as another example, again, this is just a bunch of code, which is not Rust. It's actually Python, but anyway, to do that. Moving on. Yes. So, yeah. So before, I could have done the orchestration completely automatically, but I wanted to show you the validation and the step that was mentioned by the Zeno team today about checking that the dependency graph actually can be met before you do at runtime is something that we also consider that is needed. So that validation method is part of the of our initial code that we are working on. So validating this definition. And then of course, when you click execute, if you click, basically what you see here is a bunch of files that we are generating behind the scenes for you to actually deploy and orchestrate whatever the process you want. Moving on. So in this case, and as I mentioned, we do one thing hopefully well. And so we don't want to create another model. We don't want to create another API. In this case, let's use Symfony and let's project all of these into Symfony artifacts so that Symfony can take the next job, right? So moving on. Yes, another one. One back. So as I mentioned, the extensions can be stored in any place you want on your organization or load it from other systems, like for example, loading it from the Eclipse SDV multiple GitHubs. And that's what those that wants to call out. Moving. Okay, one more. So because it's a dev container, for developer productivity, we have Symfony integrated within the dev container so that the developer can be very agile, projecting those artifacts and then sending to the platform engineering team, for example, for deployment, or they can run Symfony outside of the dev container, right? Symfony can be run as hosted API or can be run as a Kubernetes. And basically you call out the API of Symfony to start the deployment or the process that you want. Another one. So here, yeah, please, another one. So let's build YoctoOS. I started a Symfony call that has a definition, a set of configurations, an endpoint, click. Yeah, and GitHub on the other side got the call. And this just shows you that we don't want to replace any tools. We want to integrate, or we think that the plan is for us to work and integrate with whatever toolchains and CI/CD platforms does already exist in the organizations. We need to wait 1 hour before this builds. No, I'm joking. This is a screenshot. Let's move on. Yeah, another one. So now that the operating system is built, let's deploy. Again, I'm calling all of these manually for you guys to see. All of this can just be one step without any approval. But we also built, for example, notification services template that you can ask for a human approval before you can actually deploy all of these in an automatic way. Move on. Yeah, so before we deploy, I just wanted to show you in this case that I'm checking if the environment already exists. Again, it's an error just to prove you that this works. Move on. So it's not there as expected. Let's move. Again, this is part 2. Let's deploy. Symfony is running here, as you basically see from this code. Yes, please. And now let's wait for the machine to deploy. Because this is already built, let's move. And now this is the part of Azure that I wanted to show you again as part of the demo. As I mentioned, nothing of this code is actually dependent on Azure. You can see that I just succeeded deployed a software in the loop project virtual ECU for this purpose. And if you click again, seems so, click again. And yes, when I log in into the machine, I can show you this is a YoctoOS running on an ARM64. Is running the Symfony agent, in this case as a service, and then from here I could start deploying the applications that you need. So Yeah, it's deployed. Good. So just to recap and what's next. We think that the metadata services or the configuration services can be leveraged, by us, by the community, to help address this complexity that I heard pretty much all day. Again, no, one thing does one thing well. So Symfony in this case as the Cloud to Edge orchestrator as a proposal. In vehicle orchestrators, we have 3 or 4 projects already out there. Symfony to start as one API for orchestration, as we call out with its object model. And of course, this is not a replacement for any tools or orchestrations that you might have already. Where are we going? We want to open source the code, either as a project and contributing to an existing project, could be OpenDUT, or could be a blueprint itself. Again, I am not attached to just creating yet another project, but I think that it's some value proposition on the configuration services. We built a prototype that I cannot yet show to you how Copilot generates metadata and Symfony artifacts. So basically having the Copilot do that job for you before you actually do the next step. And of course, part of the next slide, we would like to work with you, bring up a community together for this toolchains or toolchains APIs and metadata standardization. We would love to have and start working with more projects. And then last but not the least, we have a couple of teams that started. And again, I would love to continue that collaboration. And this is 10 minutes later from us.
And I thought I was rushing through my part of the presentation.
Sorry for that. I was just trying to catch up with the time.
Maybe just to quickly. We can go to Q&A. Yeah, that's fine.
Any questions?
Dana?
No, we don't.
There's actually a couple of questions that are obviously a little bit late. Is the intention to make this integration of tools or tool chain as a safety critical systems tool chain? Or have you even thought about it in this direction or not?
Yes.
And then the second question would be, would it then be an automotive or SDV related or dedicated tool chain? Or do you intend to broaden the scope to even more safety critical potential used systems?
Great questions. On the first one, yes, we thought about being able to orchestrate safety critical applications. Because as you know, we have quite an amazing project out there now on the community, Eclipse SDV. Being safety certified, I think it's a value proposition in addition to what the community is doing. And using the tool chain to actually build, flash, and do every life cycle of the ThreadX with the tool chain is on our roadmap. I did not mention yet, just because I'm just finalizing how we will address these for the future. But yes, it's on our plan. Second question, yes, this. If you abstract yourself from a vehicle, this is a software-defined product. You can build any kind of software, orchestrate any kind of platform, because we are basically agnostic on that. As I mentioned, we don't aim to replace any tool, any CI/CD, all of them, they have their own value. We just think that there is value in having declarative configuration services that allows you to validate before you deploy, right? So that you avoid a lot of wasted time, wasted money, because it costs money. And hopefully with the help of Copilot, make this a little bit more intelligent. So yes, it's on our idea that this is a little bit more cross-industry, but at the moment, you will see it most likely in the SDV, as an SDV project, or a blueprint, or a member of some existing project.
And I would also add to that, I mean, given the nature that we have different companies with different interests involved, right? So obviously Felipe and Microsoft, they care about broaden that up to more industries, right? That makes sense for them. To be honest, for me, it doesn't make too much sense. So I most likely have most interest in having an SDV toolchain first. If that applies to other industries, I'm more than happy, but most likely not our, let's say, primarily focus. But yeah.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure. Sure.
Hi, can you hear me?
You want me to say if there is questions from the remote audience, they can ask or they can follow up with us also offline because we are a little bit between the beer and the beer and the beer.
Okay.
Is it okay?
So yeah, I mean, my final words actually would have been like, again, if you are either a provider of a tool today or you're thinking of building one or whatever, and share the need of that being part of a broader landscape and share the vision that Felipe and I just shared in terms of making that an open source initiative, reach out to Felipe, reach out to me. We also have AVL colleagues like Hannes, for example, is here. These three companies at least have an interest in that, so we will start building something. If you want to join that, let us know.
And you're not the only one. I mean, this is
For sure.
definitely one of the top priority at the EU level, and also hopefully soon proposal as well. So
yep.
that's definitely lots relevant. Okay,
Good.
thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you everyone.
Thank you.